So I'm here with Linda Jones, who's an architect at Campus Holden in Pembroke, and one of their jobs that we've been using as a case study is the Community Hub in Neyland in Pembrokeshire. And so Linda's kindly agreed to go over some questions that are going to help you with your planning and construction project assignment. So the questions may be directly relevant or may be good for extending your learning to achieve a higher grade. So thank you, Linda.
No problem, no problem.
So first question really was, why would a client need an architect on a project?
Right, well there's a number of tasks that an architect can apply on a project, and it will vary from the project itself, but starting really at the start, I suppose, the architect can very often help identify what the actual project is, and help assist in developing the brief. And the brief is the sort of document we use to sort of describe the project in words, and sometimes the clients don't actually really know exactly what they want, so we can help in developing that brief. We also survey buildings, we develop concept designs, we look at the immediate environment around, not just the buildings itself. Once we've got a design, then we can take it to a consultation exercise. We quite often coordinate with other specialists, so we might have structural engineers and mechanical, electrical engineers and all sorts of people, so we coordinate with other people as well. Once we've got a design, it's normally we submit it then for planning permission. We also work on listed buildings, so there's another piece of legislation which is specifically for listed buildings, which are buildings that are recognised to be important for some sort of reason, whether it's historical in their own right or historical association. So we can advise on that. Then once you've got the sort of planning permission, which hopefully has been successful, then probably the next stage then is building regulations approval. That's the next thing, and the architects usually lead on that side of things. And following on from that, or running at the same time, that can be the technical design, which is the sort of nitty-gritty of how it's going to be built. And then the final stage, I suppose, is building the actual building, and our role can vary, but quite often we administer contracts, the building contracts for the project, and we do also carry out site inspections. So we've got quite a long involvement in a project, really, from start to finish.
And that's a broad range of professions, isn't it? From
Yes.
people who would write a legal document,
Yes.
which would be sort of that when you're talking about the administering building contracts.
Yeah, we usually use standard formats, but you do, on an architecture course, you do have modules where you learn a little bit about law, so it does come into it. So yes,
So
it's
like a
very
tightly constrained agreement as to what something's going to do.
yes, it's setting out the rules. It's really for both parties. Then so it says what happens in this event and what happens in that event and how people get paid and things like that. So it's a useful document. Really. So.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, moving on. What sort of projects would a Campus Holden take on? What sort of things do you do?
We work on a variety of projects. I mean, if I mention some of the projects that we're currently working on, we're besides working on Neyland Community Hub, which is community buildings, community stroke sports building. We work on we're working on a library in Neyland, but also an archive in Carmarthen. So that's another type of project. We do housing. We work on schools. We also work on listed buildings, so and they can be from a bridge. I mean, not all listed buildings are buildings. Some of them are other things. So we work on the odd bridge, for example, and castles. So and some sort of quite substantial properties very often, but maybe not doing an awful lot on some of it. Depends on the range of the scope of the works.
So very diverse, I think, isn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. Constraints then. So if I first of all clarify what we mean by this, a constraint would be a factor that would have an influence on a design. So I want to find out really from Linda what sort of constraints an architect might have to consider when they're dealing with a project, let's say specifically with the Neyland Community Hub building.
The first sort of constraints I tend to look at are the planning constraints, because each planning authority has a document which is called something like a local development plan, and that sets out in broad principles where you can develop. So if your proposal is for in the centre of a field in the middle of nowhere, the chances are that your local planner will say no, unless it's very special circumstances. So that's the sort of starting point really. So quite often we get approached by people who say, I'd like to do something or other on this piece of land, and then we immediately refer to the local plan to see what the chances are of that being successful. So that's a really important planning constraint. Also look at the site itself, and there may be some sort of status to it. It may have a special planning status, or it may have a listed status, which will affect then the amount of work that you can actually carry out on that site or to that building. The size of it is obviously a constraint, because you can't build bigger than the actual site itself. We also look at neighbouring uses, because you try not to put in incompatible uses alongside each other. So, for example, if you're designing a school, you wouldn't want to put a school alongside a noisy industrial site, because otherwise you couldn't concentrate on your work. So things like that we take into consideration. We also look at orientation, so which way the building's facing, where the sun is and where the sun's going to set, and how much light you get in. That can affect the design of the building itself and the layout. Access, very often there are restrictions in terms of where you can actually gain access. In other words, gaining access from a road, that's what I'm referring to by that. And you have to consider also how you're going to move to and from the development in different modes. So, for example, by car, by walking, cyclist, and also disabled people. So you have to consider how they were going to actually approach a building and enter a building. There are other aspects which are constraints, which are things like character. What's the character of the surrounding area, the context really of what you're building in. Doesn't mean to say you have to copy what's alongside, but you have to take it into account, and that includes the scale, how high adjacent buildings are, things like that. Ecology, we get involved in ecology, in that very often old buildings can have protected species in, such as bats and barn owls, and even sites can have protected species on them, like sort of a reptile. This was the great crested newt is the famous one, I suppose. But there can be species which you have to take into consideration, and that can be a constraint on the design as well. There's other things then, community safety, in other words, trying to design with sort of security and avoiding crime, the potential for crime to be carried out.
So like hiding places and rat runs and things like that.
Yeah, and yes, and also sometimes it's the quality of the glazing, for example, to make sure that you've not got glazing which will easily smashed, or that if it is smashed, it's smashed in a safe way, and also locks and security cameras and things like that. Another constraint is buildability. Not every site is an easy site to build on, so sometimes you have to choose the type of material to suit that, but you also have to consider how you can build it, and that's all to do with health and safety. In other words, you have to be able to think about how they're actually physically going to build it on site. And then there are other things. I mean, I've mentioned cost, but cost is a constraint very often.
I'm surprised you put that right at the bottom, actually.
Well, it quite often is quite high up the list, yes. But I think some of the others are almost more important, really, because, for example, if you go back to the first one, the planning constraint, it doesn't matter how much money you've got. If it goes against local plan, chances are you'll get a refusal. So other things are legal constraints as opposed to project-specific constraints.
Yeah, so I guess though the hierarchy of those might shuffle depending on what the project is, or maybe depending on what you're thinking about with different codes for building regs. Sustainability is probably being pushed higher up the ranking, isn't it?
Well, there are things like this. There's wildlife acts which come into play for the ecology, for example. So we're not just being nice to these little creatures. It's actually a legal requirement that comes out through the planning. So that's an example of a legal requirement that comes in. But yes, you're right, quite right. Building regulations, access for the disabled, all those things are wrapped up in some form of sort of building regulation or planning legislation. So yeah, there is a hierarchy.
Fantastic. Here's what I'm quite keen to ask, which is, How do you communicate your design ideas with a client? I think in terms of design technology and the way we look at things, communicating ideas through sketches and models, I want to find out if any of that sort of thing goes on in the world of architecture.
Yes, we use all sorts of things really. We use models, both physical, actually that's a cardboard model, but we also use 3D modelling as well. We use drawings, sketches. It's all about communication, it's all about getting the message over. So quite often we will hand sketch, sometimes quite often the client will hand sketch something out in front of them. And then we'll also use the sort of computer graphics and 3D imaging. So there's lots of ways. So we use everything that we can really to understand.
Whatever's appropriate.
Yeah, whatever's appropriate. Yeah.
Brilliant. What about the client then? Their preferences at the stage during that design stage. How do they input their creativity to the ideas? Do they give you free rein, or is it?
It varies, to be perfectly honest. And some clients aren't interested that much in the design. They're just interested in the functional quality of the building at the end of the day. So if for example it's an industrial building or something like that, they may just want it to be the right size in order to accommodate that process and meet the right cost. So they may not actually be that interested in the design of it as such. And then you've got other clients who are very, very interested and come to you with loads of sort of images of what they quite like and things like that. And I suppose the answer is we try and listen, and that's the important thing, is to listen at any rate, and then also try and accommodate as many of the ideas as possible, if it sort of suits the concept of the design. Sometimes the idea is not possible and that can be for various reasons, including technical reasons, planning reasons, regulation reasons, lots of the reasons why it's not always possible. But we try and at least examine them and look at them, and if we discard the idea, we usually do it in consultation with the client and explain the reason why we don't think it's a good idea. The other thing as well is we the way we try to approach a building is to look to see what the client wants out of it. And sometimes, as I mentioned right at the start, the client doesn't necessarily know what they want, so you try and tease that information out of them, and part of that is actually challenging them some of their preconceived ideas. So they may think they want A, but you actually think, well, what about B? And they actually, yeah, well, I haven't thought of that. And that's part of our role really, is to challenge some of the preconceived ideas and just suggest different approaches to it then. I mean, when we're talking about Neyland, for Neyland, for example, one of the things that we looked at was we met with lots of people on this, lots of the user groups, and listened to what they said, and they made some sort of constructive comments, and then we sort of try and accommodate them into the scheme. Not everything we could, because we're dealing with lots of different user groups here, but there were some sort of good ideas that came up out of that process. So it's a useful one to go through.
Public consultations or exercise or
yes.
User group, focus groups or...
Yeah, I mean that was very much because this is a community-based building. There are a number of community groups which currently use the existing building which we're demolishing as part of this proposal, and it was important to take their views into consideration. So we met with each of the user groups, apart from the sort of client committee, so to speak, and listened to what their comments they had, explained the scheme as it stood at the time, and took their comments on board. After that, then we also did a public consultation exercise where we had a public meeting then when the designs went up for people to have a look at, and again to sort of comment on. And again, we listened to what the comments were, and then discussed them with our client, and as to whether we could incorporate them or not. As I say, you can't do everything, but you can listen and try and do it, and people do come up with some good ideas.
Yeah, and from that perspective, I think it's probably quite exciting to work on a building which has got so much input from different people to try and please them all. Must be a nightmare, I must say. But
it can be, but yeah, you just it has to be managed. The process has to be managed. Really, I think that's the important thing. So.
So I've been putting together a pack with some photographs of the build going along at Neyland. It's really been very interesting to see the construction methods that have been chosen, and that steel framework has been chosen for this particular build. But who decides on the construction method that's suitable for a particular build, and who decided in this case that would be the best solution for the community hub?
Sometimes it's down to the building itself. With this particular building, because we're designing quite a large space, it is not really a building that's best suited to some types of construction. It needs some sort of frame, and either concrete or steel frame or something or other, because it's a big span building, and that very much controls some of the options then you have with it. We usually get involved, and sometimes we take the lead on the type of construction, but we also usually, for the type of construction, we'll refer to a structural engineer as well, because at the end of the day they're the ones who have to provide the calculations to get the thing to stand up. So, and the sort of things we'll take into account when we're looking at the type of construction of the building are the client's needs, if they've got any particular needs, for example. So if it's a very, very insulated building, that might lead us towards timber frame, which tends to be a little bit easier to insulate, for example. We might look towards the actual site itself, how easy it is to actually get into the site, how easy it is to get those materials into the site. So we might choose materials which are actually easier to transport. We can also look at the concept of prefabrication, so which is where you build elements of the building in a factory. What most people can be familiar with is the sort of timber frame houses, but you can do that on a larger scale. And that is useful again where you might have an issue where if you take a crane in for a day and lift everything over the top, you get a huge amount of material and a huge amount of the building in, and it causes disruption for that 1-2 days, rather than a long period of carrying blocks back and forth or something like that.
I think I talked about with the class in the lesson about the McDonald's building going up arriving on the back of the lorry with the bathroom fittings already in place on the walls. That's quite amazing. Prefabrication.
That is prefabrication. Yeah. So, and the other thing is then is taken into consideration is the local skills. You know, the local skills in the area. So, on some projects, you may, for example, have a client who says, "Well, actually, I want to build it in blockwork because I've got a team of who lay blockwork, or I've got a good source for blocks, or something like that." So sometimes we can choose materials for that reason as well. So we usually get involved. We usually get quite heavily involved in the type of building.
Brilliant. One section that students have to talk about is the responsibility of an architect. So in terms of responsibility, what is your responsibility as an architect during the planning and designing stages of the build? Who do you have to liaise with? Who do you have to work alongside?
Okay, for the sort of planning and design stage, we usually take the lead role, which means that we are coordinating them with other consultants. So obviously the design has to sort of stand up, so quite often there'll be a structural engineer involved, for example. Mechanical, electrical, which is, mechanical is designing your sort of your heating and your plumbing systems, and electrical is lights and power and things like that. So we work with consultants like that. But there can be others. There could be acousticians. We can work with fire consultants who advise on fire safety within the building. There's lots of consultants, and our role is to sort of lead and well, usually lead and coordinate that sort of part of the design, so to speak.
At what stages of the build would you actually visit the site to inspect the work that was going along? Is that something that you'd be called on to do as an architect?
Yes, in terms of visiting a site, we like to visit the site right at the start, so before anything's built or anything's done, or if it's an existing building, before any work's done on it, because we need to get to know the site. It's good to know your context when you're designing at any rate. But and quite often, if it's an existing building, for example, we might actually carry out the survey of the building or look at the condition of it in a lot of detail, because that will form the basis of our proposals then. What you're referring to is site inspections. Yes, we do not on all projects, but we do carry out site inspections. So we will go out to site, have a look at the work that's being carried out, try and answer any queries that there may be on site. Sometimes point out things that don't look quite right, or something like that. So yes, I just try and advise and be helpful, and talk to the contractor, and it's a team effort. That's what we're trying to put across. It's a team effort. So the contractor is
that those things? Is that what they call snags when something goes Not quite?
No, snagging is what we do at the end of the project. So when the project is, well, when the contractor thinks the project is complete or very, very close to completion, then we get a call then saying, can you provide a snag? And what we do is we go out and write a list, really, of all the things that aren't quite finished or aren't quite right in our eyes. And that is part of our role under the contracts usually. And then the contractor's got a list and then he works his way through that list. Once that snagging list is complete, then that's usually when we sign off the building then for what's the contractual term is usually practical completion or completion. And that's when the client can move in as such. There's another stage then which you may also become aware, which is called making good defects. So normally if it's a building contract, at the end of the 12 months then we'll go back in, have a look around the building and look for those niggles, those things that haven't quite worked right, and we call those defects, and again then we will ask the contractor to make good those defects. So there are a few sort of times when we visit site. So, yeah.
That's fascinating, thank you. Right, one of the other stipulations we have to consider is the output of an architect, what sort of things an architect actually produces. So the output in terms of the types of drawings you put together, the types of technical documents that somebody might follow on site and things like that. So what's the output?
Right,
from
okay.
you?
Different stages, different types of drawings, different information. At the start, when we're looking at the design and we're designing, it can be sort of hand sketches, it can be computer images, it can be drawings, whatever it is to get that initial message across. Once we've sort of gotten a concept then, we will then develop it then into a set of drawings. So for normally the next stage is to submit for planning, and for that there is a sort of prescribed list of documents you're supposed to sort of submit in drawings and information. So it's usually a case of 2-dimensional or 3-dimensional images then that we put together for that. Going forward then into the technical design, there are more detailed drawings which look at everything at a much bigger scale, and we also then supplement that with words. So we actually write specification documents where we describe the project, and other people in the team, for example a quantity surveyor, would write what's called a schedule of works or a bill of quantities, and they will describe it and quite often actually quantify how many pieces of timber, for example, go into the building, or how many sinks there are, how many baths, whatever like that. So it's a mixture of drawings, words, and in different stages of the projects we use different. As it gets more towards on site, then it's less about the models and it's more about the detailed drawings.
Technical details.
Yeah.
Because you did show me there's a giant, really thick portfolio which has got, here it comes.
Yeah,
this is all the technical details of every aspect of the build.
That's right, yeah. And so we've got the drawings here, which are the planning drawings. So these are the elevations there. There's the plans. We've
all drawn to scale.
Site plans. Different scales for showing different things. So that's sort of the more of a master plan scale. So that's the sort of planning package really. And then these are the structural engineers drawings, for example. But and then we've got the construction set of drawings, which is this, which looks less pretty. Because it's more technical information that we're showing. So
is this tied into the BIM sort of system?
This particular project isn't. This is drawn on Vectorworks, so it's a 2D package. This is drawn on. But in BIM, yes, we produce the similar sort of information, but it can be done in a completely three-dimensional format. So I'll show you the project we're working on that afternoon. But one of the advantages of BIM is that it can look for conflicts. So less so on sort of conflicts within architecture, so to speak, but when you've got the different consultants working together with different designs, it's just knowing that, for example, all your pipes are going to run through without hitting structure and things like that. And there are advantages in BIM because you can see that in 3 dimensions and see whether there's a problem. So that's where that's really useful. So these are what we call our general arrangement drawings. Then we have more detailed
And there'll be an identical set of these drawings on site for the
Yes.
principal contractor to refer
Yes,
to.
that's right. Yeah. So the contractor has got a copy of these drawings. So we don't give him all this file because there's a bit of history here, but yes, no, he has a set of drawings to work from, and all from each of the consultants as well.
Brilliant. Well, coming to the end now. The last section, I guess, is helping people who find this planning construction project has really opened their eyes to the wonderful world of architecture, and if they want to take it any further, then would you be able to offer them any advice? This is my really keen students who might want to pursue a career in architecture.
Yeah, I think the first thing to do is get some experience. Contact an architectural office and see if you can get some work experience with them. I know usually it's part of the sort of what's carried out in school these days, but certainly getting some work experience. And if you can't get it in that week that's allocated within the school year, if you're really keen, school holidays, ask if you can do a week in your school holidays. So get some experience, see if you just get a feel for it that way. Design and creativity is really important in architecture. You don't necessarily, my experience was that you don't necessarily have to have a art A-level or whatever to do it, but you have to show some level of design. So if you're sketching, if you've got drawings, and you think you've finished with them, hold on to them because you'll need them for a portfolio. You have to show some sort of level of designability. Go to university open days, get a feel for the whole sort of idea about university and what can see, and you can see the sort of information that they do and the sort of designs that they do. So that's something really, really, really good. And obviously the sort of thing you need to find out what sort of grade you need as well. They do vary from university.
Building to handle number is pretty key, isn't it? Numbers, numeracy skills, and
Yes. They usually ask for. I think they used to ask for GCSE in maths as a minimum, but might not be totally up to date on that. And the prospectus has changed from year to year, so it's worth checking that out. Right. But yes, numeracy is important, and we do use it. And one of the examples, for example, is Pythagoras. I know everybody does it in school and thinks, what on earth am I learning that for? Well, I can tell you that I use it. So. And I do use Supertower as well sometimes, so it's useful stuff.
It's not like karate, so yeah. That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed for your time in there. We'll try and factor in some ability to have a closer look at the model and maybe look at some of this BIM stuff as well, and we'll move on to that in a bit. Good. Thanks for answering those questions. Wonderful.
So in this sense, it's a good way of getting an idea of massing on site, as well as just trying to develop what this building's actually going to look like in relation to what's around it. So, I mean, a big part of what started this was just taking what we had started to develop and just see how it can relate to what was already there in the changing village, and just you can see it seems to continue in the same style. So a lot of that came out of massing it in the SketchUp model.
I see you've got scenes up on the top. Do you use those to do visualizations with a client, like fly-throughs, like you see on grand designs and stuff, sort of thing?
Not necessarily in this case, but yes, because you're going to have certain views that are going to be key views, and you don't want to be, once you're actually talking to someone, it takes, especially when you have more detail in it, it takes a bit more effort to get around. So there's a few ways you manage that. One is by making lots of layers. Another is by making lots of groups and managing them in outliner. I don't know, is that something that
no, is that part of layout then, is it? Or
no, it's a part of SketchUp. I couldn't tell you if it's part of the online version, but basically every time you make a group, it's on the model, but groups can be within groups, and outliner actually shows it like a filing system.
No, I don't use that at all.
So outliner's there. I put a lot of effort into organising outliner because I know as soon as you start making a complex model, there's a lot to manage.
So you can choose what you want to edit from the tree?
Well, for example, changing village is all there. I can click on that and just go hide, and it's gone. So it's just a really easy way of managing what's in the model, because sometimes, and then your scenes will save those hide settings. So if you want certain things to show what stuff's going to look like without stuff, you want certain things to show what's going to look like with stuff. Some things will get in the way, you might want to just get a different view. So between that and layers and scenes, you can kind of manage your way around the model, either for showing someone something quickly, or just for you to get back to somewhere you want to be.
Yeah.
because you could be working on something inside a building, and you might want to go back outside and do something else, and you want those steps to be quick, otherwise you're going to spend an awful lot of time
Sure.
navigating.
I've just noticed, I've seen that you've overlaid that on is that a map from, is that an OS map that you've actually scaled up and used as an underlay?
Yeah, in this sense.
So is that geo map, I'm wondering, what have you used, when you turn on shadows,
in this case we didn't use a geomap, but it is orientated, right?
Right. So you could do the solar mapping for orientation and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this model was made before, at a time where we just couldn't seem to get that to work, whereas now if we started a new model and it was in, say, St. David's, you could put in the postcode, get that up, and then work off it in that way.
Tying it in with Google Earth then?
Yeah,
dropping the view from Google Earth, yeah.
Now I do find from my experience, if you can build something or add your own textures, it does kind of work kind of well, because Google looks right from certain angles, and other angles it looks a bit
I like
patchy.
the way you can toggle terrain and it actually geo models it. Have you seen that? So it comes in flat, but if you toggle terrain, it puts in the contour and gives you topography on it.
Okay. To be honest, I haven't done an awful lot of that. And then one of the events where I tried to make an accurate topographical model, because we had the information, it turned out to be just as massive time
and probably not very accurate.
It wasn't worth the time that went into it. So in a case like this, the site's essentially flat.
Yeah.
So you can just draw it off this is not topographically accurate in the sense that there might be a half a metre difference change between here and there, but you get the picture.
Yeah.
It's flat, so you're saving time. You're not wasting time doing something that's going to effectively look the same.
Yeah.
So yeah, we've got certain scenes here that we use for planning. So this one is probably one that's being used a bit in
yeah, we saw that on the, do you call it interpretation board then? The one that's on the front of the site?
And I think that was used in one of the Western Telegraph publications on it. And what's handy about saving a view is if you update the building, or you add something, that view's still the same, so you can do kind of a before and after, especially if something's been used regularly.
I wasn't aware of that. It saves the scene as a...
So that view is that view.
Yeah, yeah.
So if I, so we since did add a library and we did update it. That model I can't locate it at the moment, but it just means that your scene will update with it, and then you just have that exact view for before and after. It's not like
I see, yeah.
Yeah, so that element's pretty useful.
I really like SketchUp, sort of the simplified, do you know what I mean? It's not trying to be anything photorealistic or anything, it's just, I don't know. Do you use any of the styles that you go through with any of your drawings? Because that, you've got like a sketchy line edge on there and stuff, is it?
Yeah, at the moment. To be honest, we don't go too much into using these styles. A lot of times, if we actually are going to use it as a presentation image, there'd be a bit of Photoshop overlay onto it. Once or twice in the past, we have used V-Ray to actually render what is a photorealistic view out of it. You'd want to be specifically asked to do that, because there's a lot involved in that. So you generally get that for an internal view, and then you'd be starting to add stuff like skirting and plants and plates and everything to make it, because otherwise it just doesn't look like a real scene. And you're messing with light settings and various things. So we
really powerful computer to do the renders and stuff.
Like I said, we've only been asked specifically to do it once, and that was an internal room view. It took 2 days to build the model, and it took approximately a day of fiddling with render settings to get it, and that's just one room. So you'd imagine if you tried to make this into a photoreal scene, you're just adding a huge amount of time. So you'd want people to ask for it. You wouldn't do it off your own bat.
I think the important thing is, at the end of the day, this is all about communication, and if that communicates the message over, then that's all you need, to be perfectly honest. So.
And sometimes SketchUp can just be used to set up the perspective and scale for then a hand-drawn perspective, which can be done a lot quicker. You can get to a level of impressiveness quite quickly, just by doing an overlay sketch and then just adding the features, what you want to do to concisely get the message across,
Yeah, good. But that's not the the software that you'd use to do the BIM. So can we talk a bit about the BIM and the software used for that? Is that all right? Shall I move the camera to get a better view if I do that, and I can sort of cut between it?
Yeah. Is it worth opening the Revit model as well in this sense?
I can do it, right?
Just to show kind of what we're actually. I mean, I can talk through this while it's open.
Is that all right?
Just
So if I can move that around a bit to get a better view.
Yeah.
Just want to check I'm sorry, I'm in the way. If I could do that like that, I'll move it around.
So we'd managed. So previously,
Yeah.
the way you'd work through a building is by doing two-dimensional drawings, and you would be drawing lines representative of pairs of lines, be walls, windows, whatever. Whereas in Revit, when you start drawing, you're immediately drawing a wall, and that line will represent build-up of a wall, and you're adding a window which actually has all the information that the window requires. So you can make, as you develop the model, you're basically making a more real representation of the building as you go. So you continue to add detail. But what's important about, or what's very useful about working in this way, is that when the structural engineers information comes, as well as the M&E consultants information, you can synchronize it all into one model, and you can start to see certain things in 3D space that you might not necessarily pick up.
So that's the whole
on
idea
2D
behind
drawings.
that BIM, is that all that information is controlled in the one.
Well, that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is, as well as just giving a drawing package, you're actually giving information about just how you run this building in its lifetime as well. So all the information about all the plant, the service times, all that theoretically should all be in the model. So there's a lot of information in terms of that as well within. It's not just the 3D model. There's a little bit more to it than that. But the way we work is we work in a program called Revit,